The lights on the studio stage flared to life as Jimmy Kimmel stepped behind the desk, his signature grin already teasing something sharp. It was a Friday night taping, and the audience was electric. Kimmel, known for his biting political humor, had his cue cards in hand, ready to roast everyone from Congress to celebrities. "All right," Jimmy said with mock seriousness. "Now, let's talk about Melania Trump. You know, the former First Lady with the mysterious accent that sounds like Dracula got a PhD in fashion merchandising." The crowd erupted in laughter. Kimmel smirked and leaned in for the punchline. "She's got that voice where you're not sure if she's telling you a bedtime story or casting a spell on your dog." More laughter. Cameras zoomed in. The segment was trending online before he even got to commercial. But what the cameras didn't catch, at least not yet, was the face of a special guest waiting backstage. Sylvester Stallone, invited for a light-hearted interview and a promo for his new Veterans project, had heard every word. And unlike most of Hollywood, Sly wasn't one to play the quiet card when someone he respected was mocked on air. His jaw clenched. He turned to a producer beside him and asked, "That joke scripted?" The producer chuckled nervously. "He ad-libs sometimes." Stallone nodded once, calm but stone cold. He stepped away from the green room couch and made a decision right then, not to wait for his segment. Not to smile and deflect. If they wanted fireworks, they were about to get the kind that echoed. Back on stage, Jimmy Kimmel was basking in the laughter, tossing in a few follow-up lines. "I mean, come on," he chuckled, "Melania sounds like she's narrating a haunted doll documentary. Someone get her a translator, for English." The audience roared again. But behind the curtain, the tension had shifted. The stagehand wearing a headset barely had time to react before Stallone stepped past him. "He's not supposed to be on yet," someone whispered frantically into a mic. But Stallone wasn't stopping. He walked onto the set, not waiting for an intro, not waiting for music. Just pure presence. The crowd fell silent in waves as heads turned. Jimmy blinked, caught mid-sentence. Ladies and gentlemen, Sylvester Stallone," he said, trying to play it off with a chuckle. The applause was unsure, nervous. Stallone didn't smile. He stood near the host's desk, arms crossed, and stared directly at Kimmel. "You done?" Stallone asked, his voice low, calm, but laced with iron. Jimmy raised his eyebrows, still half in comedian mode. "Was just having a little fun, Sly." "That what we're calling it now?" Stallone said. "Mockin' someone's voice on live TV? Someone who can't defend herself here." Jimmy tried to shift the tone. "Look, it's just a joke, man. No hard feelings." But Stallone stepped closer. "There's a line, Jimmy. And you don't get to cross it just because there's a laugh sign flashing." The audience sat in stunned silence. No cue cards. No writers. Just the unmistakable moment when a room realizes, this isn't part of the script. Jimmy Kimmel glanced toward the control booth, where producers were now frantically signaling with hand gestures, but no one dared cut to commercial. The camera stayed fixed. This was gold, but also dangerous. "I get it," Jimmy said cautiously, trying to regain control. "You're defending Melania. Respect. I just think people should be able to take a joke." Stallone didn't budge. "You ever seen her take a joke?" he asked. "She's not on this stage. She's not sitting across from you. She didn't sign up for this. She's a private citizen now. And you're still dragging her voice into a monologue like it's fair game." Some light clapping started in the back of the audience. Scattered at first. But it grew. Kimmel looked uncomfortable now. "Okay, Sly. I hear you." "No," Stallone said, eyes locked on him, "you don't. Because if it were your wife, or your mother, or someone who came to this country and spoke 5 languages while people laughed at her for having an accent, you wouldn't be making that joke. You'd be the one storming out here." The applause grew louder. Kimmel's face tightened. All right. Point made. But Stallone wasn't done. I've played a lot of tough guys on screen, Jimmy. But I respect people who come from nothing, who fight to be heard in a world that wants to mock them just for being different. That kind of strength. That's not something to laugh at. That's something to honor. The room was still. Camera operators stood frozen, unsure if they were still part of a comedy show or watching history. Jimmy Kimmel finally stood up from behind his desk, clearly rattled now. He tried to keep his tone light, but the edge was unmistakable. Okay, he said, forcing a laugh. You've made your point. Loud and clear. Maybe next time you can give me a heads up before turning my monologue into a Stallone sequel. A few people chuckled, but it was nervous laughter, not joyful. Stallone leaned slightly forward, his voice steady. This ain't about headlines, Jimmy. It's about respect. Then he turned to the audience. You all came here for a laugh, I get that. But there's a difference between comedy and cruelty. And too many people in this town forgot the line. For a moment, even the studio lights seemed dimmer, the mood heavier. And then someone in the front row started clapping. Then another. Then the entire crowd rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, not for a joke, but for what felt like a rare moment of spine in the middle of Hollywood's polish. Kimmel nodded slowly, humbled, taking in the applause meant for someone else. I'll own it, he said. You're right. It was cheap. And maybe I got too comfortable behind this desk. Thanks for calling me out. Stallone finally offered a nod, silent, measured, and started to walk off the stage. But just before he disappeared behind the curtain, he turned over his shoulder and said one last thing, mock the powerful all you want. But leave the dignity of people who didn't ask to be in your punchline alone. Backstage, the atmosphere was buzzing. Crew members and staff stared at monitors replaying the moment Stallone commandeered the stage. Phones were already lighting up, tweets, posts, clips being uploaded with captions like, Stallone just shamed Kimmel on his own show, and, not all heroes wear capes, some wear leather boots and speak truth. Producers debated what to do next. Some wanted to cut the Stallone segment entirely. Others argued it would be worse to pretend it never happened. The executive decision was made in a hushed corner of the control booth, keep it. All of it. People are gonna talk about this for weeks. Meanwhile, Stallone stood just off camera, arms folded. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't fuming. He looked like a man who'd said exactly what he came to say, and was finished. A young assistant nervously approached. Mr. Stallone, they still want you for the veterans segment. We can rework the intro, or cut it short if you want. Stallone glanced at the stage, then back at her. No. We talk about the vets. That's why I came. He walked back onto the set, this time to polite applause, less explosive, but more respectful. Kimmel was already seated again, the desk no longer a shield, but a shared table between two very different men. All right, Jimmy said, voice softer now. You've got a new project. And after that entrance, I think people are going to listen real closely. Stallone nodded. It's called Home Front. It's about real heroes. The kind that don't ask for attention. They don't make speeches. They just serve. And sometimes, they get forgotten. The audience leaned in. The vibe had shifted. It wasn't comedy anymore. It was real. Authentic. Raw. And Kimmel. He just listened. For once, the loudest man in the room wasn't the host with the mic, but the one who chose to speak up when it actually mattered. The conversation turned deeply personal. Stallone spoke not just as a celebrity, but as someone who'd spent decades portraying American grit, yet never lost sight of the real thing. He talked about veterans he'd met while researching Home Front. Homeless ones. Injured ones. Forgotten ones. Some of these guys risked everything, he said. They come back with scars, some on the outside, some on the inside. And the system? It thanks them with paperwork and silence. The studio was completely still. Kimmel, to his credit, didn't interrupt. He looked genuinely moved. Stallone continued. This show of yours, it reaches people. Millions. You've got a platform, Jimmy. Use it to punch up. Not down. That hit hard. Jimmy leaned forward. You're right. I've had veterans in my family. I forget that sometimes when I'm chasing the next joke. I guess, tonight was a wake-up call. There it was. Sincere. No script. No sarcasm. And the audience responded not with cheers, but with something far rarer, quiet respect. Stallone finally let a faint smile tug at the corner of his mouth. We all screw up. It's what you do after that counts. Then he reached across the desk and shook Kimmel's hand. A camera zoomed in. It wasn't the viral moment anyone expected, but it was the one that would be remembered. By the time the show wrapped and credits rolled, the atmosphere in the studio had shifted from entertainment to something bordering on reverence. Stallone exited the stage quietly, not basking in the applause, not looking for praise. He simply nodded to the crew, declined interviews, and walked out into the cool night like a man who hadn't just lit up Hollywood, but grounded it. Back inside, Jimmy Kimmel sat alone for a moment after the taping, staring at the cue cards that now felt hollow. The punchlines scribbled in Sharpie didn't land the same way anymore. One of his senior writers stepped in. You want us to rewrite tomorrow's monologue? Kimmel didn't look up. No, he said. I'm gonna write it myself. That night, news outlets blew up. #StalloneLive trended across platforms. Clips of the confrontation went viral within the hour. Everyone had an opinion, Hollywood elites, veterans groups, media personalities, even a few politicians. Some mocked Stallone. Others applauded him. But one headline stood out above the noise: when Rocky fought for respect, and won. Meanwhile, Melania Trump, watching from her Florida residence, remained silent. But her longtime spokesperson issued a rare public statement: we appreciate Mr. Stallone's defense of dignity and decency. It speaks volumes without needing a microphone. And just like that, a night intended for late-night laughs became something else entirely, a reminder that sometimes, the strongest man in the room is the one who speaks up, not with rage, but with principle. The next morning, major networks scrambled to secure interviews with Stallone. CNN, Fox, even 60 Minutes sent inquiries, but his team declined them all. No comment, his publicist said. Mr. Stallone said what he needed to say. He's moving forward with his Veterans Project. But the story refused to die. By noon, The View debated the incident, with Joy Behar calling Stallone old-school chivalry in a town that forgot what respect looks like, while Sonny Hostin suggested his actions reflected a deep discomfort with Hollywood's obsession with punching down for applause. Meanwhile, Kimmel made a quiet but significant move: he issued a public apology. Comedy should never come at the expense of someone's humanity. I crossed a line. Sylvester Stallone reminded me of that, and I'm grateful. We all need a reset sometimes. Consider mine started. The apology stunned critics. Kimmel rarely walked back jokes. But this time, he did, without excuses. That same day, Stallone held a small press event, not about Kimmel, but about Homefront, the Veterans Initiative. Flanked by retired service members and families of the fallen, he spoke from the heart. I didn't come on that show to throw punches, he said, but sometimes you've gotta call timeout when the game's gone off track. That moment wasn't about me. It was about decency. And if that sparked a bigger conversation, good. Let's not waste it. His words spread fast, on veteran forums, in classrooms, on talk radio. The moment had become more than viral. It became a pivot. A conversation. And for once, America was listening. By the end of the week, something unexpected happened. A bipartisan group of lawmakers, yes, bipartisan, introduced a new resolution in Congress aimed at expanding mental health services for veterans. The press dubbed it the Stallone Clause, even though his name appeared nowhere in the text. When asked about the connection, a senior aide from one senator's office replied, "The momentum came from that moment." Stallone reminded people, across political lines, what honor and accountability look like. It hit a nerve. Veteran advocacy groups flooded Stallone's office with thank you letters, testimonials, and invitations to speak. But Stallone stayed quiet. No tours. No book deal. No cable pundit rounds. Instead, he funded a new wing of a struggling veterans rehab center in Detroit, privately, and without press. When local journalists caught wind of it, a spokesperson simply said, "He's not interested in headlines. He's interested in results." Meanwhile, Jimmy Kimmel, true to his word, devoted an entire episode of his show the following week to highlighting veteran stories. No jokes. No skits. Just real people, real struggles, and real solutions. It was the highest-rated episode of his show in over 2 years. And for once, social media didn't argue. They applauded. Because something rare had happened. Not a scandal. Not a feud. A correction. The ripple effects didn't stop. Days after Kimmel's veteran-focused episode aired, Melania Trump herself broke her silence, not with a fiery tweet or a press conference, but with a single post on her official site. In times when voices are mocked, it is meaningful when one stands up not in anger, but in honor. Thank you, Mr. Stallone. It was signed simply, Melania. The post was shared across platforms, some mocked it, others praised it, but the tone was clear. A line had been drawn. And the man who drew it hadn't done so for applause. Meanwhile, Stallone returned to work behind the scenes on home front, which now had doubled its funding from private donors inspired by his stand. Hollywood producers, sensing the cultural shift, rushed to greenlight new stories centered on real veterans, not comic book heroes. And something else happened, too, quieter, but just as real. Comedy writers across late night started talking. Not about censorship. Not about losing edge. But about intention. One veteran writer from a competing show put it this way in a viral post, "We've always asked, is it funny? Maybe now it's time we also ask, is it fair?" As for Jimmy Kimmel, he invited Stallone back on the show weeks later, not to settle scores, but to co-host an entire night focused on veteran success stories. They called the segment, "The Real Fighters," and when the show ended, Jimmy looked at the camera and said, "Sometimes, the punchline isn't the end. Sometimes, it's just the beginning of a better story." The night of The Real Fighters was unlike anything late-night TV had seen in years. No snark. No side eyes. Just raw, compelling stories from former soldiers, medics, and military families who had quietly endured more than most Americans could imagine. One segment featured a young amputee who started a tech company designing prosthetics for wounded vets. Another told the story of a former Marine who now ran a program pairing service dogs with struggling veterans suffering from PTSD. Stallone didn't just host, he listened. Leaned in. Asked thoughtful questions. No bravado. No monologues. And Kimmel? He gave the spotlight away willingly. Halfway through the broadcast, Stallone turned to the crowd and said, "You know, people think heroes look like me. Big, loud, dramatic. But most real heroes? You pass them on the street and never even notice." The audience gave a long, emotional standing ovation. The ratings were record-breaking. That night's success caught Hollywood off guard. Networks that once rejected veteran-centered pitches as too serious or too small market began rethinking. Suddenly, agents were calling veteran consultants. Scriptwriters were asking for stories rooted in real sacrifice. A Netflix executive tweeted, "The age of empty celebrity worship might be fading. Maybe it's time we tell stories that matter again." And behind it all, quietly but undeniably, stood Stallone, the man who interrupted a comedy show to defend dignity, and ended up redirecting the spotlight onto those who earned it the hard way. Weeks later, Stallone stood at a quiet ribbon-cutting ceremony in Detroit for the new veterans rehab wing he had personally funded. No reporters. No red carpet. Just families, local leaders, and men and women who had worn the uniform. He didn't give a long speech. Just a few heartfelt words: "This place isn't about me. It's about keeping a promise, to never forget the people who served. We owe them that. At the very least, we owe them that." That clip, though filmed by a local news crew, eventually found its way online. It didn't go viral with shock or scandal, but with sincerity. It was titled simply, "When the Loudest Voice Was Used for Someone Else." Back in Los Angeles, Jimmy Kimmel changed, too. His jokes grew sharper, but more thoughtful. Less mean. He hired a new consultant to review material, one with a military background. And once a year, he now dedicated an entire show to veteran advocacy, always inviting Stallone, not as a celebrity guest, but as a co-host and partner. Late-night TV, once addicted to punchlines and put-downs, had rediscovered something far older than comedy: respect. In an era defined by outrage and noise, it was one quiet decision, by one man, on one stage, that reminded millions what strength really looked like. Not muscles. Not fame. But courage. To speak up. To stand firm. And to protect the dignity of others, even when no one expects you to.